Claiming central space immediately, this pawn advance opens diagonals and eyes a swift queenside development. Developing the knight towards the center opens up possibilities for rapid piece play and hints at a flexible setup. Developing a knight to a natural square, this prepares castling and supports a central pawn advance. Opening the path for the bishop, black solidifies the center and prepares for development. Establishing central control and preparing to launch queenside expansion. Embracing a fianchetto setup, black prepares to activate their bishop on the long diagonal, aiming to contest central influence and potentially develop a kingside attack. Developing another knight to bolster central influence and prepare for the queenside expansion that often follows this pawn structure. Developing the bishop to target white's central structure. Pressing the knight with the bishop immediately aims to disrupt black's kingside development and create potential pawn weaknesses. Challenging the bishop's placement forces a decision, potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure or forcing white to concede development tempo. Retreating the bishop preserves its scope, preparing to contest control over crucial central squares and potentially stifle black's queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to a more active square, seeking to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, all while challenging white's aggressive central setup. Preparing to castle queenside opens aggressive attacking possibilities on the kingside by leveraging the open g-file. Opening the center this way creates immediate tension and potential for pawn breaks. Sacrificing central pawn structure to open lines for attack, aiming for queenside initiative. Capturing here relinquishes central control, opening a diagonal for your bishop to develop more actively, but potentially creating pawn weaknesses. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this move calmly reinforces white's pawn structure. Finally securing the king, black prioritizes safety and prepares for future central action, a prudent reaction to the pawn structure. Developing the bishop to its active diagonal prepares for queenside expansion and potential pressure along that flank. Solidifying the center's pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn advances toward the queenside, while also opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. Castling here consolidates white's king and prepares to activate rooks along the newly opened central files. Asserting queenside influence, this squares up the bishop and eyes the d4 pawn, complicating white's center control. Securing the central king's file becomes paramount, and this redeployment aims to exert pressure along it. A strategic repositioning, the rook now eyes the open c-file, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for central action. Preparing to double rooks on the d-file, aiming for increased pressure against black's potentially weakened pawn structure and centralized king. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest the d-file's dominance. Redoubling rooks on the d-file reinforces pressure, preparing to exploit any weakness created by black's pawn structure. An aggressive knight repositioning, aiming to pierce the queenside pawn shield with timely e5. Shifting the bishop aims to improve its diagonal scope, perhaps preparing for a future kingside expansion or rerouting through h4. Asserting queenside pressure along the b-file, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create weaknesses. Unleashing the knight to its natural central square from the wing, aiming for greater activity. The knight now aims to infiltrate the queenside, potentially targeting weak pawns or creating unexpected attacking angles. Preparing for potential pawn breaks or consolidating the queenside, this move addresses space and king safety simultaneously. Developing the bishop here offers better diagonal influence and prepares for potential pressure on the queenside. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure, this stabilizes white's position, preparing to contest the open queenside files with greater security. Reclaiming the c6 square grants the knight a more active post, eyes fixed on the central d4 pawn. Threatening the bishop on a6, this knight ventures into active play, seeking to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially seize control of central squares. Black repositions the queen, creating new attacking possibilities against white's isolated pawns while preparing for potential piece exchanges. Opening the bishop's diagonal aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. Shifting the bishop aims to redeploy it to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses on the queen side or supporting a pawn push. Shifting the queen there subtly pressures the queenside pawn structure, while preparing for a potential queenside pawn storm. Reinforcing the queenside pressure, this rook now eyes the open c-file, posing a direct challenge to white's central control. Sacrificing the queen for such little material gives black a significant material advantage and opens up critical lines for counterplay. Exchanging the knight on a5 opens a vital diagonal for the queen and signals a transition toward simplification. Initiating a knight's repositioning toward the king side, aiming to contest the central squares and potentially open attacking avenues. Dissolving white's bishop pair exchanges a key defender, potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure and leaving the d-pawn more isolated. Reclaiming the knight's central influence is key for white, strengthening their position after the exchanges. This pawn advance secures the knight's post on a5 and curbs white's potential queenside expansion. Reclaiming the e1 square opens avenues for the knight and prepares a potential kingside advance. Reinforcing the knight's central presence, this maneuver prepares for a potential queenside pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure. Reactivating the knight's central potential, this maneuver aims to improve its board presence and support a future kingside initiative. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central influence. Initiating a central pawn advance to seize space and potentially open lines for attacking play. This maneuver intends to destabilize white's central pawn structure, seeking active piece play on the kingside. Clearing the bishop's path for future central influence offers a subtle but important positional improvement. Unleashing the bishop towards the kingside opens up attacking possibilities, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares around white's monarch. Aimed at freeing the bishop, white seeks to activate the rook and create threats along the third rank. Aggressively targeting the light squares, this knight leap forces white to reconsider king safety and pawn structure. Exchanges are necessary to simplify, but this opens black's knight to a more active post after the trade. Capturing the bishop eliminates an active attacking piece, simplifying black's defense while solidifying the pawn structure. Reclaiming central mobility, this knight repositions for a more active role, eyeing the kingside pressure. Reconnecting the bishop to the queenside reinforces piece activity and prepares for potential pawn advances. Initiating a pawn storm opens lines but weakens the kingside structure, demanding careful calculation. Repositioning the bishop to e7 seeks to untangle lines and perhaps prepare for future pawn pushes or simply a more active diagonal. Shifting the king to a more active central square prepares to contest the upcoming open files and supports pawn advances. Navigating to a more active square, the knight targets white's queenside pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to g1 opens a diagonal for the king and prepares to redeploy the piece to a more active square. Seeking to untangle its pieces, black aims to reposition the knight for a more active role. Reclaiming the knight's central presence is key to unlocking white's potential. Shifting the king offers the most mobile square for its eventual journey to the center, as the queens are off. Unleashing a pawn storm to gain queenside space, while potentially weakening white's own king's safety. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, black ignites a sharp struggle for initiative and king safety. Unlocking the e-file opens a dynamic struggle, forcing black's king into a potentially exposed position. Embracing the open central files, black surrenders pawn structure for potential piece activity, hoping to exploit white's slightly exposed king. Opening the e-file presents a sharp tactical dilemma, forcing black to choose between immediate confrontation or strategic retreat. The rook sacrifice aims to shatter white's pawn structure, opening critical lines for your remaining pieces. exploiting the open d-file to create immediate threats against black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Seeking to dislodge the enemy knight and gain control of the open file is a sensible ambition. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as the board opens and lines electrify. Attempting to inject dynamism into a cramped position, but this creates weaknesses around your king. Unlocking the e-file is paramount now. This exchange simplifies and exposes black's king. The rook's sacrifice clears the king's path, activating a powerful queenside attack. The king's central promenade initiates an active endgame, aiming to exploit exposed pawns and open lines. Exchanging the bishop on f6 solidifies white's central pawn structure and simplifies the position into a favorable endgame for them. Focusing on centralizing the knight and preparing to support the pawn advance. A bold knight sortie seeks to disrupt white's newly consolidated central pawns and gain immediate outpost activity. Consolidating the king's position offers a safer haven from the remaining threats. Liberating the knight to a more active square, setting up potential pressure on the queen side. Repositioning the knight to e4 seeks to control central squares and disrupt black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop's square provides crucial defense for the vulnerable king, preparing for potential pawn advances. Reactivating the knight to a more central square aims to bolster white's pawn structure and offer better defensive coverage. A bold attempt to rally the monarch, bringing him to the center for potential activity. A well-timed central knight repositioning to contest squares and potentially create passed pawns. Unleashing the king into the center, a bold gambit for active play despite the material balance. Repositioning the king to the more active d2 square prepares for potential pawn, pushes and supports operations on the queen side. Unleashing the h-pawn creates immediate central conflict and opens avenues for the king's escape. Initiating a king hunt by advancing the monarch, aiming to exploit the currently vulnerable opposing king. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking chances against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Opening the h-file, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and potential pawn weaknesses. The bishop's check forces the king to retreat, sacrificing tempo for the opponent's king's safety. Securing the king's retreat allows for piece regrouping and preparation for the coming pawn storm. The bishop re-enters the fray, seeking active squares and threatening to disrupt white's knight outpost. Expanding on the queen side offers a new avenue for piece activity and aims to disrupt black's king's safety. Black boldly contests the open file, aiming to disrupt white's rook coordination and inject life into their own pieces. Consolidating the king's safety by moving it to a more active square is paramount here. The knight scurries to a better square, potentially eyeing the exposed king or preparing a disruptive sortie to the queen side. Securing the pawn majority with knight support, simplifying into a winning endgame. Activating the king and solidifying the pawn majority on the queen side provides a solid platform for the endgame. Securing the pawn with this capture initiates a dangerous kingside breakthrough for white. Preserving the bishop's activity on the g1 square prevents immediate pawn advances and maintains defensive coverage. Pioneering pawn thrust, aiming to unshackle the bishop and seize territorial advantage. Opening the e-file offers a potential escape for the king, but it also invites white's knight to penetrate. Securing the pawn's path to promotion, creating a decisive spatial advantage. King's march to the center, a bold attempt to influence the game's final stages. Unleashing the knight to this central outpost exploits the exposed black king and controls crucial squares. Abandoning the pawn structure opens a pathway for white's king to penetrate. Snatching the pawn on a5 initiates a decisive queenside pawn race. Exposing the king to the centralized bishop's attack creates significant king safety issues. Snatching the pawn on a6 opens up the king's path to control the board's center. Eliminating that annoying bishop offers no compensation for abandoning control of the important c-file. King hunting begins as the monarch bravely ventures into enemy territory, seeking a swift conclusion. Seizing the open file, black aims to disrupt white's pawn majority and create counterplay. The pawn's advance on the c-file now dictates the immediate endgame strategy. Black surrenders the crucial central pawn, permanently opening the king's defenses to the powerful advancing white pawn. Seizing the critical central square with the king opens the path for the remaining pawns to advance, a vital pursuit in this endgame.